Good morning. Why don't we just have the two of you quickly introduce yourselves, and we'll go around the table since we have quite a few new members in the committee, and then we'll turn it back over to you.
Sure, I'm Caroline Sherman Gordon. I'm Wolvermont's Legislative Director. I'm also the owner and operator of Fool's Farm, a small sheep farm in Tunbridge, Vermont. And I also work part-time in the Southworth Market in Southwark.
My name's Graham Eubanks-Struppenow. I live in Marshfield with my wife and our 3 kids, all under 4, 2 twins amongst them. And I run a beef business called Robinson Hill Beef and do some agricultural research there as well.
Richard Nelson, first year legislator for Orleans 1, town of Derby, and I'm a dairy farmer.
Jed Lipsky from Wild One, second by Ann here.
William Morgan, I represent Grand Isle County, West Milton. This is my 4th term here, first time in the agricultural committee.
David Durfee, and from Shaftesbury and County.
Heather Supernaut from Barnard, 3rd term on the committee. So glad to see you both.
Don O'Brien, 4th term on ag, Tunbridge, which Caroline was in, and Royalton. And I should add that her champion Rams came from our farm.
Oh,
Craig Burt from Cabot. Farmer. Thank you.
you've met Sedonia. Representative Boslin is also a new member of our committee, maybe joining us online at some point this morning.
I'm actually online right now. Hi, everybody. I'm watching remotely.
Good morning, Michelle. If you have a
Good
question
morning.
at any point, speak up if I don't see you.
Okay, I'll try to raise my virtual hand or jump in and unmute my mic, but I'll leave it off unless I have something to add. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Should she introduce herself?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, do you want to actually introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm from Wyndham 3, Northern Wyndham County, Westminster, Rockingham, and Brookline, and this is my first week on the committee.
Well, we're glad to have you in this morning. I'll just mention to the committee, when we heard yesterday from Michael Grady with legislation that the committee had worked on last session and passed, one of the things that he mentioned, I don't remember the exact number, the bill number was involved chickens, like whole chickens and chicken parts. And that was a suggestion that members of rural Vermont brought to the committee last year. And I think of it as a success story, something that we did that made a positive impact, very tangible positive impact. So let's hear what you've got on your minds this year.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having us in, as always. As I said, my name is Graham Eubanks-Struppenow, and my formal position is Policy Director at Rural Vermont. And I'm going to start our introduction today, and I'm going to hand it over to Caroline partway through. As you see here, Rural Vermont was founded in 1985, so that makes this our 40th anniversary year, which is pretty exciting. I first got involved with Rural Vermont in 2013 when I got in trouble with the state around on-farm slaughter. I got involved as a board member, and then over time became a part-time staff member. And a lot of folks who roll in and out of Rural Vermont have similar stories. We're a statewide, member-based, farmer and farm worker-led, not-for-profit organization. We're based in Montpelier. We're statewide. We extend an open invitation to this committee for collaboration and hearing from community members and other experts on issues that may be before you. And in general, I hope you'll see us as a resource and partner in making policy. We appreciate that stance in the past. So we're a horizontally led organization. And here you can see a picture from our retreat this last summer with some of our board members on here. Some of our staff members, not complete, but we have a board of more than 12 people. It's a majority farmer and farm worker board. When we're saying we're member-led, that means that we work with our members and non-members and allied organizations to educate, organize, and advocate about some issues identified and determined by those communities based on needs, based on opportunities. Our mission is to organize, educate, and advocate in collaboration with local and global movements to strengthen the social, ecological, and economic health of the agrarian communities that connect us all. And you'll see that, I mentioned we're a statewide organization. So we work at the state level and the local level primarily, but we're also advocate and collaborate in national and international spaces. both directly and through our membership in the National Family Farm Coalition, where Caroline and I share a seat in the executive committee. This is a picture of NFFC from a few years ago. You see me and my, I think, 2.5-year-old daughter in there. Caroline's in there too. And we also are a member organization of La Via Campesina through NFFC, which is a peasant and food sovereignty-based organization, one of the largest social movements in the world. And our grassroots organizing director, Molly Wills, is our liaison with that organization. So as this is an introduction to rural Vermont, and this is a new biennium, and it is our 40th anniversary, I thought I'd take a little time to bring you through some of our history. Some of our work that's happened in the State House over time, some of the issues we focused on, the people we've worked with. And I'm going to move sort of quickly through this because I know you want to get to the actual issues for this term as well. Yeah, so here we go, 1986, 39 years ago. You might recognize there Anthony Polina, former Senator Polina, who's one of the founders of this organization, also with another foreign representative who was my piano teacher as a child over in East Montpelier. I don't know, I can't remember the name right now. Andy Christensen, and a couple other community organizers and farmers. You can see this is one of the slides that I always love, one of these original protests at Rural Vermont event. I think this still stands for a lot of the work that we look for. Just that farmers are people, all people deserve standard of living, quality of life. You can see some of these issues on this original board here. This article from 1986, farmers last ditch attempt for survival. This is during a period of time where dairy farms in particular were just folding at a newly found exorbitant rate, and farmers are having a hard time getting their voices heard. And this organization really came about to support farmers getting their voices heard in places where they're having a hard time getting it heard. We see that looks like milk dumping at times and taking direct action to get attention. You see it looks like blocking cheese plants at times. We're talking about debates around bovine growth hormone, both at the state level, but that also went national. Talking about use around current use and land use legislation in the 90s. Even talking about international trade agreements. So I talked about international work. This extends far back to our beginnings, talking about impacts on farmers in the US and around the world. This is, again, showing that our work transcends not only the state level, but goes to the national level. We're working on BGH in this case in the 90s. And again, some of these, like the combination of art and direct action, bringing attention to the demise of small family farms over time. And this in particular shows some of our emphasis and our national coalition's emphasis on the power of agribusiness and corporate power at sort of hurting our small communities, our public sector, and family farms. Seeing some more actions throughout the 2000s. This is when GMOs really came to the fore, and there was a lot of conflict between farmers because there were things like the Farmer Protection Act in place at the time, and a lot of questions about who's responsible if your farm is found to be growing a seed that you may or may not have planted. And these debates over time were strong over time. We can still hear from folks in the State House about how hard this was, this period of time when you have different farming communities really at each other, but also with the power of the corporations behind some of that. We see farm IDs, and for some of you who are cattle farmers, like if you're still farming cattle, sir, like I know I got a notice this fall that we have new electronic IDs being added, and I think there's another step at the federal level coming soon. So this is just showing that this is a legacy issue, and there was time when we were still pushing back against this urge for more identification systems for animals. You mentioned the chicken bill. I just want to show you this in 2006, 2007. There was a farm and a restaurant in Waitsfield. In the Waitsfield, the restaurant, the Original American Flatbread, wanted to serve the chicken from across the road on their pizzas. And they decided, well, this isn't legal, so we're just going to hold a civil disobedience event, and we're going to do it and see what happens. And after that, the legislature worked with us. Well, this is the hemp bill, which also happened during that period of time. So that's an issue we worked on historically. You see, well, nevertheless, I'll keep it here. This is the time when the first chicken bill came about. This is when you all decided to work with us to make it possible for people to slaughter chickens on their farms and sell them, not having gone through a USDA inspected plant, of which there are very, very few in Vermont. And the legacy issue of rural Vermont. We talk about raw milk and some of the original work around that in 2008. And again, that's an issue that we've worked on over time and has gradually improved. Here's the Farm Fresh Milk Restoration Act, work that all came through this chamber at one time. Here we're talking about on-farm slaughter. This is one of the issues that originally brought me to rural Vermont, and one we continue to work on. You see here Mary Lake, who you've seen in committee in the past. She's an on-farm slaughterer, itinerant slaughterer. And here she is pregnant with one of her kids who are much older now, as you imagine. So Mary's still doing this work. She is traveling with us to Washington, D.C. again this fall to advocate for on-farm slaughter at the national level. In February. Again, GMO labeling. This is Carl Russell and Lisa McCrory. They run Earthwise Farm and Forest. Carl passed away suddenly a couple of years ago, really unfortunately and sadly. But this is just an example of us hosting our on-farm, our small farm action days at the State House, where we bring in farmers to talk about all types of issues with committees. And that doesn't have to be any of our priorities. It can be other issues. Carl was someone who was a passionate speaker to on-farm slaughter and his work as a horse logger as well. This is just, we do events around the state. This was an event at the Ethan Allen Homestead Farms for New Americans, hearing what their issues were, understanding how they're growing food, what their cultural traditions are, but also what their needs are from a storage perspective, from a regulatory perspective. Community organizing, go around the state, meeting with lots of people, hearing about issues, supporting our migrant farm worker community. This was back in the beginning of Milk with Dignity, before Ben and Jerry's had even signed. Talking about composting, talking about poultry foraging. These are more recent issues. I'm sure some of you have been here in recent years are more aware of. Here some of you are. I think that's what you, Representative O'Brien, from the back. Tom Gilbert of Black Dirt Farm up at Buzz's in Berlin. Healthcare, just really trying to bring the national research on how farmers and working lands folks are impacted by healthcare to the conversation around healthcare, to make sure that those needs, because folks are really disproportionately impacted in this community. We are close to injury. We don't have a lot of money, et cetera. Again, on-farm slaughter has moved to the federal level. So you'll hear more about that from Caroline, but we continue that work with Senator Sanders' office, Senator Booker's office, and Senator Welch's office, and hopefully some other sponsors coming up with the new administration in place. We've started a People's Agroecology School here in the Northeast now, which is modeled after agroecology schools in Central and South America and around the world. This is more connected with our work in La Via Campesina. And through that work, we're bringing people from all over the world to share their experiences as farmers with farmers here and hopefully exchange that otherwise. So here you see pictures of Freddie Congo in the bottom, my bottom left, might be your bottom left as well, yes, who's coming from Ecuador, Mexico, and Yorli's here from Nicaragua with her child. We see these big gatherings we've been hosting to bring people together across the Northeast around agroecology and these different movements. Here's another family from Nicaragua visiting a dairy farm in the Northeast Kingdom, Sweet Rowan Farm. And just some more of the work of that agroecology school, doing work brigades, supporting farmers in their planting, learning from farmers, but also contributing. We do workshops around the state, on-farm slaughter, poultry processing. We show up at farmers market with materials. We do artwork. This was made at the Farm Aid concert this last year in New York. And then we have, materials we distribute. See Healthy Soils, Healthy Farmer, Healthy Humans up there. This is some of the stuff we do, trying to keep it both culturally enlivening with art, but also dealing with the real nitty-gritty issues of our lives day to day as farmers and farm workers. And with that, I'm going to get into some of the stuff I'm focusing on this session in the role. The Farm Security Fund. So this is, well, I'll just read what I wrote so I don't go off the rails too much. So we're asking the legislature to pass the Farm Security Fund. It's a new piece of legislation that will provide reliable, rapidly available recovery funds for farmers impacted by climate emergencies and extreme weather. Rural Vermont has worked with NOFA Vermont and a large group of stakeholders in the agricultural community over a number of months to consider this. This goes from the Farm Bureau to Farm Viability to the Agency of Ag, all across the spectrum. We're looking at the impacts of some of our recent significant climate and weather-related events, how farms, farmers, and farm workers and those supporting them have needed to respond, what resources have been available to them, how adequately they have functioned, what the gaps are, what the needs are. We know that Vermont is a unique agricultural state in a number of ways, right? From our landscape and how weather plays out across it, but also to the diversity of farms here in terms of the type and the scale of farm. The Agency of Agriculture survey following the flooding in 2023 found that 70% of applicants were not covered by crop insurance. And we also know that even the farms which are covered by crop insurance aren't being made whole or having all their losses addressed after these events. So we know that farmers need that rapid relief. We know that getting funds out quickly is important, easier to do at a local level with a state-based program. And we're excited to be working on this project and to share more about it as we move forward this session. And I think, NOFA will be in here very soon too, and many other ag organizations to speak to this, and we can have more conversation about this over time.
You mentioned the agency's also been involved.
The agency's been a part of the conversation as well. And right now there's a bill being drafted, and I'm ready to share any more information until I see the final language about the appropriation itself. And we're also having conversations with the federal offices about the funding related to climate disaster that's coming forth. So I think Vermont's going to anticipate getting a bunch of money through these federal block grants, which will mean the state can choose how to distribute that money. And, you know, there could be an interplay here as well. So I'm still waiting to hear a little bit about what the plans are for the appropriation itself.
Hey,
Somebody would know.
that's, Route 2 heading up through, that's the bottom of French Hill at the end. So that's Dave Cronin Farm.
Whereas that
Both sides of the road, way up in the top right-hand corner, that's Cameron Clark's farm. She's an organic grass-fed dairy that farms up on the hill, and those are fields back to the right-hand corner. The Conant's heifer barn there, that's Paquette's nursery right there on the left.
all the glass houses are over here.
Yeah. And the Winooski River runs way over here.
That French,
To the right.
Williston?
Yeah,
So if you go off that interstate going up 89 by Richmond, actually, you look
Yeah.
right in that whole valley going.
Yeah. yeah. And that was the scene on the Lamoille, on the Connecticut, on the Winooski, on the Cisco. We lost 200 acres in 2003.
Oh, my gosh.
Last year, we only lost 100. Call it a win.
It's extraordinary. Um,
Federal farm bills now got monies for that. But let's think about the people in Western North Carolina that got it worse. And they still haven't been made even near fixed.
all throughout the Southeast.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so anyway,
absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that. So this is, one of the forefronts. And of course, climate recovery, climate response and adaptation and supporting farmers in this era goes beyond this, but we know we also need these emergency funds to support in that event, or people just don't have a chance to recover at all at times. Cannabis Equity Coalition. So over the last few years, we have seen more than 250 new farmers, and these are just the outdoor producers in one particular sector of Vermont's agricultural economy. But you wouldn't know it because these producers aren't considered farmers. The product they produce isn't considered agricultural. They can't produce on land of the Vermont Land Trust. They can't produce on land which is part of an NRCS contract or on land the tenure of which is funded in any way by the federal government. They're audited multiple times a year by multiple entities. They pay thousands of dollars for insurance and banking and basic administrative costs. We estimate an average tier 1 producer spending at least $15,000 to $20,000 a year for administrative work alone, just to have that license. And amidst these unreasonable burdens, they can't even sell their products directly to consumers, meaning they're mandated to immediately lose half of the value of what they produce to someone else who will capitalize on the value of that work. So we've been working with NOFA, Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, Vermont Growers Association, and the Green Mountain Patients Alliance since before the regulated adult use market started in Vermont. As you see here, our goal is holistic. It recognizes the history of harm related to criminalization of cannabis, but also saying if there's going to be an adult use regulated market, we need to be economically equitable. We need to be agriculturally accessible. There's very few products farmers can grow to make money off of these days. We're all member-based, not-for-profit organizations, and we're representing stakeholders affected by Vermont cannabis regulation. And again, we just want to offer ourselves as a resource to committees, including this one, as you look at these laws. This year, we've engaged in 3 separate legislative convened working groups since the last session ended. There's one on outdoor siting and advertising. I imagine your committee will be very involved in this outdoor siting conversation. Medical and social equity, and I'm personally more involved in the outdoor siting and the social equity side of that conversation. We've also continued to meet with different communities, allied organizations, the Cannabis Control Board, to grow mutual understanding and support, and that includes municipalities as well. So a few of our clear priorities here, establishing ongoing funding and expansion of the Cannabis Development Fund to include a farm viability type of apparatus to support smaller producers. So folks, if you aren't familiar with farm viability, supporting business planning, basically like helping you get a small business off the ground through that process. To establish a proportion of the excise tax which reinvests in communities. And this recommendation is being finalized with the Cannabis Control Board right now and other actors, including the Land Access and Opportunity Board. So I don't have numbers there, but I'm happy to bring more once that's all finalized. And I think you'll hear about that from the Land Access and Opportunity Board itself, as well as other actors around this conversation. We are looking to strike language adopted last year, allowing new municipal powers over outdoor cultivation, these quote unquote cultivation districts with pre-established maximum setbacks. We continue to we propose, as we have done prior to last year, to continue to enumerate in Vermont law status of agricultural for outdoor producers. That means they can't be agricultural under federal law, but we can give them the status, all the different aspects that would be provided otherwise. Vermont has been in the beacon nationally for this. We have moved substantially on this, more than a lot of other states, but New York has now recognized adult use cultivation outdoors as agricultural. And we have moved backward over the last year. I think you'll see in the work from the working group on outdoor siting, the data from the municipalities, from producers, from subject matter experts, that we see no evidence or substantial enough evidence to justify the actions taken last year, which we know at the very least are going to affect at least 10 to 12 of these producers who will functionally not be able to operate their businesses anymore based on these required setbacks. You'll hear more about that over time. Direct market access. You've heard my introduction about this topic. Small farmers in particular depend on direct markets to exist. We have for a number of years advocated for tier 1 and tier 2 cultivators and tier 1 manufacturers to have direct market access that allows them to sell seeds, living plants, and product directly to consumers. We don't have a market which is saturated. You'll hear that a lot. We have a market which is bottlenecked. There's only one access point to consumers, and it's retailers. You have 400 producers trying to get into a very small number of shelf space, as opposed to saying, how many of these can we create or scale appropriate regulations to have a point of sales directly to consumers, so consumers can access what they want in their region, and producers can make a just livelihood based on the product they're selling and not lose half the value to a middle person who has done none of the work on the product. Public consumption is another one of our priorities. You can only consume cannabis if you own your home or property you're consuming on in Vermont. So we talk about tourism, but really there's no place for tourists to legally consume cannabis. And we heard in testimony last year from the director of the CCB that that's often done in their cars while they're parked, because that's a legal gray area. I don't think that's either a safe or an equitable environment for us to be in as a state. We need a market in which it's established for legal mechanisms for people to be protected to consume a legal product. And we don't have that. New York has a law which allows people to consume cannabis anywhere tobacco is consumed. We think that's a very realistic and sensible law to begin with. And then we have medical program equity, and I can't speak to that as much as some of our other folks. If that conversation comes here, I'm happy to bring experts in, but thank you very much. Next, Fair Share campaign. I'm going to quickly go with this because this is a larger coalition. You all may have heard about this. This is a coalition on equitable taxation in Vermont. This coalition proposes to increase taxes on personal annual income over $500,000 by 3%. The proposal would raise $74 million each year in state tax revenue. It would only affect the wealthiest 1% of Vermont taxpayers, bringing their tax burden more in line with that of most people in Vermont. We see this as low-hanging fruit for addressing economic equity and public resource needs in Vermont. We've been working with a number of organizations around pesticides, both meeting with organizations. Well, it's tough. It's a tough issue because this is really for us an issue around just transition for farmers and just transition for people in the environment and communities. We're working right now to Protect Our Pollinated Coalition to monitor and influence the follow-up work to H706, which was a neonic bill from last year. We'd like to ensure that the process established for variances, these are the exemptions, for integrated pest management and the associated issues. They have integrity environmentally, but they also have integrity agronomically and logistically for the farming community. That's sourcing seeds. We heard about that last year in particular, and making sure folks are prepared to do this transition in 2027, in particular around seeds. We're also looking forward to continuing discussion on the implementation of Act 131 from last session. That's S25, I believe it was. And that's a bill, for folks who weren't here, that is around consumer products and PFAS, which are these forever chemicals. And listed in that bill were restricted and non-restricted use pesticides as items which must be assessed. And we want to make sure the pesticides continue to be looked at in this bill and are not disincluded. There's been some talk about them being disincluded. We've seen substantial evidence from independent testing pointing to PFAS contamination in pesticides. Something you'll be aware of, you'll probably hear follow-up on with S25. In terms of the last few things, and this is the last of my presentation, we're supporting the needs of our migrant farm worker community in a time of increased threat. We're supporting NOFA's request for base funding supporting its crop cash and fair share programs. You'll all hear more about that from them, but Farm Share subsidizes CSA shares for limited income Vermonters by paying 25 to 75% of the CSA cost. The crop cash doubles 3 Squares Vermont, which is the SNAP benefits for fruit and vegetables, and now it goes beyond produce as well. We support the Farm to School and Early Childhood Education Coalition. And they have a request for base funding for $500,000 for farm to school and early childhood grants, as well as $500,000 for local foods incentive grants. Something I want you to be aware of is we're beginning to do some research on the cottage food laws in Vermont. So that's like the laws that are often based on income thresholds, saying if you're a home baker, you can stay at a home baker scale using your home kitchen before you have to update your kitchen, your septic, et cetera. Let's say that the threshold is 6,500 gross for home baker. There's home canning, et cetera. Those laws haven't been updated in a while. We've heard from a lot of folks that they really need to be looked at. So we're bringing together a coalition of people who are in these businesses to say, what do you all want to change? What's going on? What are the problems? So we hope that either this session or next session, you all will hear from us on that. I think the last item that Caroline and I can both speak to is just some concerns about this petition and related to the RAPs and how water quality is going to be regulated in Vermont, the role of the Agency of Agriculture on our farms, and how the EPA is going to determine to sort of parse that out and how you all are going to determine to also parse that out. I think this conversation goes beyond just water quality. I think we can look at the cannabis conversation as a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for how we're seeing municipalities in particular pushing for more power over the regulating agriculture. And as we see population shifts in Vermont and demographics change and just the density change, these conflicts are coming up more often. And we're really concerned about how farmers might be impacted, especially people growing in more densely populated areas, and their ability to have the state agency of ag regulating them as opposed to their municipality regulating them. And I'll leave mine there, maybe hand it over to Kim.
Maybe there's questions just for Graham while I transition the display here.
Any questions? Great, thank you,
I
Graham.
know that was a lot.
Thank you, Chair. Do you support a right to farm bill? That what I heard at the end.
Well, there already are right to farm laws. So yes,
We have the weakest one in the country.
well, we don't support a lot of the right to farms that are out west. We work with the National Family Farm Coalition. We've looked at those laws. We might support some amendments to our right to farm laws here, but we wouldn't support a wholesale change to some things like they have in Missouri or other states. But the rebuttable presumption, we very much want that's what we're concerned sort of going away is our nuisance protection law.
That if we have a right. I'm working on a right to farm bill for all farmers,
Great.
all farmers.
Yeah, we'd love to hear the conversation around it, what you're looking at, what you're hearing as considerations. Are there particular things you're considering right now or you want to make sure are changed?
A little more in 2 days.
Yes, I want to get together offline and
I'd be really curious to hear it.
chat, yeah. The cottage food industry that you mentioned there, sort of second to last of the list. I know that there are legislators who are having those conversations. I've been asked to take a look at that as well. And the limits, the thresholds are, as you said, quite dated. So it's been years and years since those numbers were since the statute was updated or maybe written in the first place. So inflation has long rendered them sort of meaningless. There may be conversations happening sooner.
That's great to hear. And if there are particular representatives you'd recommend we speak to, that would probably be helpful for us to know. And I know Caroline's been doing some research into other states' laws in New Hampshire and otherwise. And as you said, the thresholds are either much higher or sometimes even non-existent.
Speak to me about it. I'd like to be a part of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, Carolyn, did you want to jump in?
Continue on there. Thank you all so much for having us again. Just for the record, Caroline Sherman Gordon, Legislative Director of Rural Vermont. And as Graham said, we dearly appreciate the successful collaboration we've been having with legislators of this committee for the course of our 40-year history as a nonprofit organization that advocates, organizes, and educates on issues that affect the agrarian communities that feed us all. So just quick recap of recent and pending legislation. As Chair Durfee mentioned, we really celebrate and thank you for last year's passage of, it was Act 93, that also now allows poultry producers to sell on-farm slaughtered poultry, not just as whole birds, but also in parts. And as Graham shared, rural Vermont is really known to work in favor of the unfarmed slaughter of poultry and livestock for many years now, and we're proud to spearhead legislation with the leadership of our Senators Welch and Sanders, who are also going to reintroduce a federal bill, which, by the way, also is receiving endorsement from our Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets here in the state. And that's the Livestock Owned by Communities to Advance Local Foods Act, short Local Foods Act. And that would clarify in the Federal Meat Inspection Act that it is legal when farmers sell livestock alive. And then the new owners have that animal slaughtered on the farm where it was raised without inspection. And that's already the law in Vermont, and actually over 27 states across the country allow for that. And we believe this is has great chance to pass Congress, the new Congress, because it's a bipartisan issue that does not have money attached, and it would actually simply clarify in law what is already written in USDA guidance. Then just quickly, more about our members and my role as legislative director. I'm monitoring much of your committee activity and also the Senate Act Committee. And we're sharing that information about pending legislation with our members and really strive to organize for opportunities for our farmers to voice their concerns and ideas with you directly in the legislative process. So as Graham mentioned, for over a decade now, we've been collaborating with you all and also Know for Vermont on having these small farm action days here in the State House. And that is a format where farmers, activists, food enthusiasts come to the State House to learn about the legislative process, but also get a chance to speak to the agricultural committees. And this year we hope to schedule with you all 2 of those events. And yeah, just hope for your continued support in this new composition of your committee to hear from farmers directly and the many multifold issues they might bring to you. Please know me as a resource to organize for farmer input on any of the pending legislation you might be concerned with. Then I want to speak quite a bit about land use and conservation, which might not be something that this committee had been taking stake on in recent years, but we would actually see that change. And here's a little bit of background why. So I've been representing rural Vermont in the Vermont Conservation Strategy Initiative on the agricultural lands working group this past year. The VCSI, that is Vermont's 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 process, that's led by the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and the Agency of Natural Resources. And it's to implement Act 59 of 2023. And that was an act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection. And during the inventory phase of this engagement process, we've actually been quite dissatisfied with the transparency of the process and its compliance with public meeting laws and Vermont's environmental justice policy. So last fall, Vermont Law School Center for Agriculture and Food Systems had one of their students research the issue. And they suggested that Act 59 implementation, now known as the Vermont Conservation Strategy Initiative, has fallen short of compliance with the state's open meeting and environmental justice laws. For example, the records posted under the VHCB VCSI website are inconsistent and unorganized. While some of the required information is there, it appears incomplete and is not clearly presented. And they did a second memo that researched where 30 by 30 is even coming from nationally and internationally. And it's also exploring rural Vermont's concern that the initiative is intended to serve the development of carbon markets here in Vermont. And as Graham said, we're part of the largest international food sovereignty movement, La Via Campesina, and the National Family Farmer Coalition, who both call carbon markets false solutions to climate change, because they're designed to commodify nature and to enrich natural assets companies instead of realizing the systemic changes farmers voice they need to grow more food and become better land managers. The research indicates that some states use carbon markets as a funding source, but not all states anticipate carbon markets as a source of revenue to realize 30 by 30. And then a third research paper looked at alternative pathways towards community resilience and biodiversity protection, because permanent land conservation with easements would cost Vermont approximately a total of $375 million over the next 5 years to only reach the 30 by 30 goal. And that does not include the administrative expenses or land management costs. So we at Rovermont stressed that this pathway would actually contribute to drive the already occurring property price inflation and the inaffordability of farmland for farmers and the lack of equitable housing access, so that alternatives are desperately needed. Without going into too much or any detail of the recommendations of the research paper specifically on alternatives, I do want to mention that that is exactly the discourse Rovermont is seeking with our members and allies, and that we are in the process of gathering and brainstorming ideas to protect farmland from development and also make farmland affordable for farmers, because we desperately need a new generation of farmers who currently belong to that demographic the governor mentioned, who trying to leave the state again after they found out they can't afford buying farmland here while farming it. We did speak to the governor's Future of Ag Commission about that. Should I stop here for questions?
It's all right.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to, since you're talking about the 30 by 30.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, agricultural land, conserved agricultural land doesn't count towards that total.
You know, we're actually just did an inventory of what land is conserved. Part of it is agricultural land. But what the plan is will be the next phase, the planning phase. And we to date have no info on what that's going to look like and if there's going to be continued stakeholder engagement. So we actually have a meeting with VHTD on the 23rd of this month to scope that out. And so nothing is set in stone yet.
I'm making a note. That's Representative Lipsky.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thank you for your poignant observation. I just want to comment. I don't want to side rail your presentation, but look forward. A lot of folks, organizations in the working forest community very disturbed by the Wall Street International carbonization market of forest land, and we look forward to dialogue with you in depth on this issue, because it's very, very disturbing to an already vulnerable sector of the working lands.
Representative Nelson.
Vermont Land Trust lands are in the 30 by 30, 50 by 50, as far as I know. We also have a bill coming from one of my colleagues to allow current use lands, which are fluid, but allow current use lands to count to that.
Exciting. Yeah. And that is an interesting.
Thought you might enjoy that.
I think we do, because almost already 79% of all agricultural lands are enrolled in current use. And so that's something we stressed in the process, that we dearly need to look at that as well, and need to also consider how to reform the program to really secure the longevity of the protection of farmland. And yeah, so I'm excited to see that bill and to be working with you on that.
Maybe just speak to clarify too, like, there currently is the VSCI and the 30 by 30. And part of what Carolyn is saying too is that there's these broader goals related to land and agriculture and food resiliency and equity of access to that land, which aren't a part of the 30 by 30 process. Even if the conserved land or current use land is in it, it's not going to be the centerpiece. The goal is still conservation, it's biodiversity, et cetera. The question we're asking is, do we need a space to talk about land, food resiliency, and climate change, and equity of access to that in agriculture over time, as opposed to being sidelined at a table where the purpose is to talk about something else, and we're sort of a little body at that table trying to get our thing out of it. Because our board isn't even sure if we would support, for example, conserved ag land being in the 30 by 30 process at all, because we're concerned about what that means over time, depending on what types of things that land gets wrapped up in.
Speaking about carbon markets. So just to, I'm almost done with my thoughts around land conservation. I think another format in which this conversation is taking place, as Graham mentioned, is the Governor's Future of Agriculture Commission. And we will very much look forward to see where that work might lead this year. We certainly have been talking to them. They just did a whole round of interviews around Land Act specifically. And also, just speaking with this committee, want to mention that, there was quite a bit of legislation that passed out of the General Assembly these recent years around land use. But neither of those acts had centered the protection of farmland from development at all. That's namely the Act 250 revision and Act 181 of 2024, the River Corridor legislation, Act 121 of 2024, the Home Act 47 of 2023. But as we mentioned, Act 59 of 2024 doesn't center farmland protection, but biodiversity protection, and also not the Global Warming Solutions Act. Act 153 of 2020 focuses on farming or farmland protection. I've also been serving as a commissioner on the Two Rivers Ottauquechee Regional Commission for a couple of months now. That is Vermont's largest regional planning commission. RPC is the acronym there. This year will be a huge year for RPCs across the state to implement all those recent land use laws and to review the relevant sections of their regional plans for that implementation. And as I just begin this work, I want to share that the TRORC's regional plan currently doesn't even itemize agricultural land on its map at all. It's all lump sum rural area. So I want to leave it there.
We got her on the soapbox now.
So the last issue I want to speak to is accessory on-farm businesses. So Rural Vermont advocated since 2017 that a farm's limited development of an accessory on-farm business should not subject the parcel to Act 250 regulation. For Rural Vermont, scale appropriate regulation of AOFEs has been a core part of our mission to promote community scale farms and the local food and relationships they provide. So at the very end of last year's session, the legislature passed a law that now requires farms that offer farm stays or farm events as an accessory business to get an Act 250 permit. And it also hinders the development of value-added products, which is the preparation or processing of farm products, as an Act 250 permit is now required unless the AOFB will make at least 50% of the total annual sales from products produced on the farm where the business is located. Rural Vermont had reported on this legislation, which was introduced as H128, with support from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, VAFM. But we expressed concern around the impacts these changes would have on the farming community. And we did not endorse the bill because we think that many farms who currently operate accessory business actually were under the impression that they were exempt from Act 250. So the H128 bill did not pass, but then last minute, the critical language was adopted into the land use bill H687, that's now Act 181, and you find the language there on section 18 on page 25. So we started now to receive complaints from some of our members about this new policy, who were saying exactly that. We thought we were exempt from Act 250. So we're now actually looking for legislators who are willing to work with us on this again to ensure that the regulation of accessory business upholds the original legislative intent that was to support the farms that do those accessory business, recognizing how essential they are to secure viability in farming. And with that, I thank you all.
I'm going to say, Caroline, I think that there's a difference of opinion on Rural Vermont's interpretation. So I'm going to ask whether we can talk offline about this, whether you're aware of any of your members or anyone who has received a ruling that would suggest that the interpretation that you just suggested is the one that's being applied, because that is counter, I would say, to the intent of the legislature in a couple of ways. So let's have a chat. And if we need to review that, then I think we certainly can.
Sure. And just quick comment about that. I think from our understanding, maybe the law had been ambiguous in some ways. As you say, there was a difference of interpretation. But the good thing is when something is ambiguous, nothing might happen. Now that there was a clarification, certainly that scale has shifted to the one of the permit. And I will just share, many of our members find that's the straw that breaks the camel's back and feel like that's counterproductive to what was maybe the original legislative intent. that recognizes farms need these businesses to even farm.
Yeah, I'll just say on the record, I don't think there was any intent in the legislation we passed last year, and the committee members who are returning can, feel free to weigh in here too. I don't think there was any intent to require anyone to get an Act 250 permit who hadn't previously been required to get an Act 250. That was not the intent of the legislation. So I think there's an interpretation that it may be something that can be clarified fairly quickly.
It'd be really helpful to hear legislative council's opinion or somebody else's on that, just to early on, so we don't.
Certainly do that.
Exactly.
Good. Had you completed your comments?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, no, thanks for the discussion too.
I have a quick piece of context I'll just add, if that's okay, Chair. And that's, Karen was talking about the land piece, and have you all heard from New England, Feeding New England at all over the last couple of years? Maybe Ellen, Kaler, or some other people? So one of the exercises they do is sort of a 30 by 30 around food resiliency in New England, right? What would it take to get 30% food resiliency in New England by 2030? So not 30% of land and conservation, but 30% of our own food, and 50, by 2050. And that's the kind of, we need to be thinking, in our perspective, we need to think about climate change in that respect too. How are we sourcing what we need from our region? And currently the climate change legislation doesn't do that, and it actually creates liabilities and is often regressive for working lands people. But what would it look like if we know that 30% of our food needs across New England, we need an additional, I think 700,000 acres in production plus 500,000 it's underused in production, just for 30% across New England. If we thought about just on the Vermont scale, what would that look like? Because we're not thinking about that right now. And we're also not thinking about relocating farmers based on our historical development patterns. Like, I'm in a river valley. I have 5 acres. It's not much compared to what you have taken every year, last couple of years, out of my pasture.
It all hurts.
It all hurts. But the question is, we have people whose entire farms are in river valleys. Like, do we have a farmer relocation fund if that's necessary? Have we thought about, if we can't continue to farm because of what the rivers are carrying these days, eventually in certain areas due to toxicity, how are we going to make that food resiliency happen in new places in the landscape? If it's protected and permanent conservation, what does that mean for our human needs? And that's where the holistic part of the conversation we'd like to see push into is why is food and human needs not centered in part of this climate change conversation?
And just to add to that quickly, it's also, that's why this piece of protecting farmland from development is just one side of the coin. The other side certainly has to be to make it affordable for farmers, because we have to be realistic that we're importing over 90% of our protein, 90% of our grain, 90% of our fruit, 70% of our produce, over 50% of our dairy right now. And it's not going to change if we're not going to get farmers on the land.
Hey, Graham, I just want to comment on that New England Feeding New England. One of the most impactful and hopeful and riveting testimony we received last year was on that collaboration with the New England states to produce and consume 30% of our collective produce from seafood on the Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts coast to what we offer. And that was one of the most hopeful and riveting testimonies we had all year, in my opinion.
I can reflect back to some of those folks. I'm sure they'd love to hear.
We're going to have Ellen Kaler tomorrow to give the committee a introduction to the work that they're doing, the Farm to Plate program, and 30 by 30 is an extension of that. It's just a timely count. Other questions? Representative Boslin, if you're listening and have a question. Okay. Well, then I think we can pause there and thank you for coming in. We'll take